almost about that time. Right about now. Right about now. Funk, bunk, 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 soul brother.
Jana Pruden, welcome to the Right About Now podcast.
Hello.
I am so happy to have you back, my favorite true crime writer out of Canada.
Oh gosh, I'm so happy to be back.
Well, you've done it again. You found an amazing story, very sad story, but one that's important for people to hear. And I just thought, I want to get into all the details of how you found the story and how you reported this story, but let's tell the story to our audience here. I set it up in the intro, but I'd love you to sort of take us through this story. Maybe we could start by just kind of understanding some of the principal characters in it. Can you tell us a little bit about Helen Naslund and her husband, Miles, sort of like how they met and the sort of beginning of their relationship?
Yeah. So this really is a story about Helen Naslund and her husband, Miles, and their three sons, Wes, Daryl, and Neil. Helen meets Miles when she is a teenager. He's a couple years older than her. And she describes not even so much necessarily wanting to start dating him, but that he decided he wanted to date her and started following her around until he kind of won her over. They get married pretty quickly and they end up moving to a farm. They both always had a dream of farming. That was one of the things that was a real connection for them. So they moved to a farm in rural Alberta, Canada, a couple hours away from where I live.
Okay.
Very soon, and in fact, even before they're married, there is severe intimate partner violence perpetrated by Miles onto Helen. And as the kids are born, things essentially get worse and worse. And, I don't ever like to say that some violence is worse than others because, of course, it's on a spectrum. And but I think, to me, as a veteran crime reporter, what Helen suffered is some of the worst domestic violence that I personally have ever heard, and that includes extreme physical violence, extreme emotional, psychological violence, sexual violence, and also sort of a new form of domestic violence that I hadn't really considered before, which was actually sort of abuse by working Helen and her sons into the ground on this farm. And certainly Helen lived with the knowledge for many, many years that Miles could kill her, that in fact probably would kill her, and also take out potentially her children, kill her children. He threatened to do that all the time, and potentially other people, police officers or others in the community. And
yeah, he was quite a fella. And what a sad relationship. Let's talk a little bit about their background. So she comes from a very large family, right? Because, part of when you're hearing the story, you're kind of like, where's her family through all this? So talk a little bit about her upbringing and why, maybe her family wasn't there to help her through this. Like, what was her upbringing like?
she did come from a big family. Helen didn't want to share too much or talk too much about her childhood. But her sister Sharon did describe it as a childhood that they just kind of survived, and that there wasn't necessarily a lot of nurturing. Sharon herself got into a very violent relationship and told me about that when she went to her father and told him about this domestic violence relationship that she was in as a victim, that her father said, well, you made your bed, you have to sleep in it. So there wasn't necessarily support from all kinds of the family, even if Helen, or all parts of the family, even if Helen would have looked for it. And it was a little bit of a different time, the 80s, when Helen and Miles met.
Right.
But I think we also see really quickly that Helen becomes very isolated and that she doesn't really have contact with her family or have people to talk to about it. And that those on the outside, including Sharon, even if they saw some signs that it was a bad marriage, they didn't really grasp how bad it really was. So I think it's a combination of factors of not really having anyone to reach out to, maybe not having fully what the supports that some people might expect from a family, and then also people from the outside really truly not knowing how bad it was.
Yeah. Can you talk a little bit about how Miles controlled her, in terms of her activities, her, who she spoke to, et cetera? Like that was such a huge part of his abuse, right? The isolation.
Yeah, and I think in a way some of that abuse was the most um the most devastating to sort of who you are as a person. I mean, there's control. Literally, he had a gun with him often. He would point it at his wife and children, pull the trigger sometimes, playing Russian roulette with someone else's life, essentially. It was described to me by both Helen and two of her sons that if you went out, even when they went to school, when they would get home, you would have to say, account for really every single moment from when you've been gone, who you talked to, what they said, everything that happened. You couldn't really do anything without him. And of course, the consequences of going against him, of irritating him, of angering him would be extremely severe. I mean, there's a part that really sticks out to me and that I know has been really affecting for a lot of people, where Helen says that she couldn't even count how many times she had a gun to her head and to hear that click. So we really are talking about the most extreme levels of control and life-threatening abuse of Helen and her children.
I think when you hear this story, the first question people have or think is, why didn't she just escape? She's got the kids. Why didn't she just get, one day when he's asleep on a drunken bender, he was a big alcoholic, did she just not up and run away with the kids? And can you explain that? Because I think that's a big, important thing to understand for people to understand who don't have experience with domestic violence like this.
Yeah, I think that is one of the most common questions. And it's also a question that really shows a lack of understanding of how complex the dynamics of an abusive relationship can be. So there's the very real physical threat that Helen knew. Well, even if she did get away, so where's she going to go?
Yeah.
They had
They're in the
very
middle.
little resources,
I mean,
very little money.
yeah, I'm not familiar with Alberta that well. I have been to parts of it, but not the part you're talking about. This is the middle of nowhere, right? Like there's not a lot of people around, like where are they going to go? They're in the middle of a
Yeah.
very isolated. Yeah.
And then even if you do get away, where do you go? How do you rebuild your life? Where's the money come from for that? A lot of people have said to me in the course of this, you just go to a shelter, a women's shelter. Well, that's a fine idea, but a women's shelter, you don't just get to live there for the
Right.
rest of your life with your kids. I mean, most shelters, they are completely packed to overflowing. Last year in Alberta, there was something like 10,000
Ugh.
women and children who were turned away from shelters due to lack of space. So yes, you may get to an emergency shelter. You may be able to stay there for 2 to 3 weeks. Then you have to find somewhere else to go. If you don't have money, if you have limited job prospects, Helen's from a rural area. She's a farm woman. To leave her farm, to leave her animals, to leave everything she's built. And where are you going to go and how are you going to rebuild your life there? And then the other piece of it is he going to find you and what is he going to do if he does? She essentially tried to leave him twice, once before their marriage, and it went very, very badly. That's how she describes it. The second time he came home as she was putting the kids into, grabbing some stuff and ready to leave. And he choked her until she was blue. He locked her in a bedroom for a day with her kids and his guns on the outside of the door. It was a truly terrifying experience. And it truly taught her that she could never do that again. And when you ask Helen, when you ask other people, if they feel like she could have left and gotten away with her life, it's very unlikely. I mean, her sister Sharon described it to me. I don't think he ever would have stopped looking for her. So, it is a question that a lot of people ask. Why didn't she just leave? She had a job. She was able to leave the farm for her work. But when you look at the psychological effects of living under that kind of control abuse for a long time, even having the confidence to feel like you could get away, and then just realistically, do I think she could have gotten away and that she and or other people wouldn't have been killed? I highly doubt it. I
Might have not
don't
made.
believe that she could have.
So she was a prisoner, or both her kids were prisoners in their own home at one point. So, but during this time, over all these years, their farm starts losing money. They start having to cut costs, and she's even forced to work outside of the farm. Talk a little bit about that, because you would think, okay, now she's actually allowed outside of the farm, and she has some job at like a, I can't remember what it was, like a rental store or something like that. But he still controls her even when she's outside, right?
Yeah, so she was working at A1 Rentals, which is like a farm and industrial supply store. And so she does leave the farm. Of course, he calls her there constantly, is constantly monitoring who's coming in and out, who's saying what to her. And she's doing not only that full-time job, more than full-time job at A1, but then also still doing everything at the farm. And they had gotten into this very bad financial situation, really because of him. Many people outside the family described that he treated his wife and children like slaves.
Mm.
Their youngest son described to me that his childhood was like growing up in a lab, an experiment to see how much work you could get out of someone and how badly you could mistreat them. So they're all living, working nonstop. Meanwhile, Miles is overextending them, so they become very deeply in debt. They're in danger of losing
Meanwhile,
everything.
Miles is doing nothing, by the way. He's the laziest, right? He doesn't do anything except for yell at everybody and hit them
Yes.
and scare them. Yeah.
And point a gun at them. Yes, absolutely. And that in fact is what leads us toward. So even with Helen working, the money situation is still terrible. She still is very highly controlled by him, and that kind of leads us up into the long weekend here, the Labor Day long weekend in September of 2011. So it's harvest, which is very, very stressful because they're financially right on the line anyway, of right on the brink of going bankrupt. And of course in harvest, it's kind of your make or break time for the whole year. If harvest doesn't go well, you can have lost essentially your whole year's worth of work. So very stressful time, and really things at a breaking point, a ticking time
bomb. There's a one interesting, well, not interesting, but I know it meant a lot to her, where Helen actually sees a psychologist or a psychiatrist or some mental health expert. Can you tell me a little bit about the circumstances that led to that, and then kind of how that played out?
Yeah, so Helen tried to leave twice, as we've talked about.
Yeah.
And realized after the second time that that would be impossible, that she could never leave him, could never get away. And so the other way to escape that she eventually sees is to kill herself.
Mm.
And this is, I think, a source of real shame for Helen. It was horrible for her to think that she got to a point where she would leave her children and kill herself, but truly that's the point she was at. And so after one suicide attempt, a very, very serious suicide attempt, she gets sent to a counselor. And I think she starts to come close to opening up a little bit to that counselor. And that counselor asks to meet Miles. And Miles, to Helen's surprise, agrees
Yeah, I was
to
amazed
go.
that he agreed to that. Yeah.
But I think what we realize after is that it was a trick. He was going to see what the situation was,
Right.
and then immediately shut it down and told her that she could never go there again, and she never did go there again. So when she looks back, that's sort of the only other glimmer that she ever had, that if maybe she'd been able to open up more, and maybe the counselor had been able to get more of a sense that maybe the counselor could have helped set up an escape plan or something. But again, maybe, lots of maybes.
All right. So at this part of the story, we excuse me. At this part of the story, we've led up to this. It's just a tension in this home and a just untenable situation. There is a gunshot one night. Tell us what happened that fateful night without telling us, I guess. Because it's kind of
Yeah,
history. How do you tell it? How do you tell the story? Yeah.
I mean, it is a mystery and it isn't. We do say in episode one, you know, that uh, Miles is reported missing by the family. And they say that he went out to cut hay and that he never came home and that his wallet was there, but his gun was gone. So clearly an implication that he had gone to kill himself. So that's what's reported to police in 2011. But we do say in episode one and make clear that he wasn't missing. He was dead. And Helen, in fact, would go to prison for killing him after admitting to shooting him in the back of the head while he was sleeping.
And they don't discover that this until 6 years later. So what does that tell us?
Yeah. I mean, it's an interesting thing. Helen and her sons all keep that secret for 6 years until like one of them goes to the police. But also many, many, many other people in the community lived those years knowing that he wasn't missing and
Right.
that something had happened, but not really asking any further questions than that. I talked to so many people who said, well, I knew he didn't go off to kill himself, but I really wasn't asking any questions about what did happen. Sort
And,
of a,
and like, were the police asking any questions? They sort of took it at face value, like, oh, the guy just disappeared. Nobody really liked this guy. So when people were pretty relieved that he was just gone, it was a
I
small
think,
community.
yeah, I think there was, for the people in the community, there was a kind of country justice.
Yeah.
They knew that there was abuse in the house. A lot of people knew what was happening to Helen and the boys, not the full extent, but at least had a glimpse of what was happening. They saw Helen with black eyes. They could tell in the way that she interacted, that she was being abused. There were lots of stories about Miles's use of guns on the farm. So they weren't asking too many questions. We don't exactly know what the RCMP did to find him. So there may be some searching that happened that I'm not aware of. But I do think it's fair to say, there was no, there were no big door-to-door searches. There was not a lot of, his face was not on milk cartons or anything like that. No. So they may have made some efforts, but it was not, uh, it was not a big case in the media. There were not big searches happening or anything like that.
Do you want to talk about why do I keep like just getting over a cold. Do you want to talk about why Daryl goes to the police? Should we go there, like, and what he tells them? Can I ask that question?
Yeah. Yeah,
Okay.
I think that's fair.
So let me ask that question. So her youngest son, Daryl, eventually goes to the police and tells them everything. Why did he go to the police after all these years? And then what did he tell them happened?
Yeah. I would say he doesn't tell them everything. He tells them his specific version of
Right.
events. There's a lot of questions about why Daryl went to the police. There is an idea, this is an idea Helen has and several other people, that, I mean, Daryl had a lot of trouble with drugs, some problems with the law, and that he went to the police to get himself out of trouble in relation to other things that he was doing, to use it as leverage, basically use his family as a bargaining chip.
Right.
Daryl certainly tells the police that it's because his conscience was bothering him and that he had to get it off his chest. I guess that also is possible. There are some questions about, I guess, some gaps or some conflicting versions of events that Daryl gives to the police that make him look quite innocent in the whole thing. And the police even say that in the interrogation. But I think at the bottom of it, actually, it would have come out eventually. I know that Helen and her youngest son, Neil, were really struggling with the truth of what happened. And I know that it was bothering them. And I think that, Daryl brought it all to the surface, but honestly, I do feel like it would have come out eventually. I don't think that Helen could have continued to live with it for too much longer. She would occasionally call the RCMP and push them on why they weren't investigating more. And I don't know why she did that, except that I do think that she wanted it to come out, because those 6 years that she lived with this secret over her head and looking over her shoulder, that was not freedom either.
So it comes out, at least according to Daryl, that Helen killed her husband, Miles. Does it also come out what they did with the body and how it just disappeared?
Yes. He talks about how it ended up at the bottom of a slough or a pond on a nearby property. It was welded into a metal truck toolbox, one of those ones that goes, big box that goes in the back of a truck, and paddled out into the middle of this body of water and disposed of there. The guns were disposed of in another slough. So and the car, Miles's car, had been buried somewhere else, the car that was supposedly missing with him. So Daryl gives enough information that the RCMP go to the farm and they find all of this evidence exactly where he said it would be. And Helen and her youngest son are arrested for murder.
And in the trial, what is her defense? The abuse?
Well, this is the really interesting thing, is there was no trial.
Interesting.
There is a defense. So even though Helen admitted to police in her interrogation that she shot Miles in the back of the head while he was sleeping, this can be a form of self-defense, specifically when you deal with people who are living with severe domestic violence.
Right.
So typically it's called the battered woman defense or the battered wife defense, sometimes the battered spouse defense, although it is primarily almost entirely used in relation to women. And there is a precedent in Canada that you could be found not guilty even as an abused spouse, even if you did shoot your husband in the back of the head while he's sleeping. There's a famous case here where a woman shoots her abusive boyfriend, as he's walking away from her. And so part of what this recognizes is that traditionally self-defense law was really based around men fighting each other, defending themselves from another person who may be the same size, where you're essentially on a more equal fighting field.
Yeah.
Whereas with a battered woman, there may be a massive size difference, as there was with Helen and her husband.
She's tiny, right?
She's very tiny.
And
he was
big.
Yeah, very big.
6'2", yeah, big guy.
Yeah, big guy. Also severe psychological advantage, where he's been beating her severely for many, many, many years. And that we know that if she tried to defend herself in the midst of an assault or an attack by him, the chances are that she is going to be dead. So we know that here in Canada, a woman is killed by her partner, ex-partner, every second day. And I'm sure that the statistics are quite similar in proportion in the United States. So the battered wife defense takes into account that self-defense is different when a woman is defending herself against an abusive partner, and that also it recognizes that the threat does not necessarily have to be imminent, and that someone who's been the victim of long-term abuse can actually recognize before they're in danger that they are in danger. So the battered woman defense is a defense that likely would have been used if Helen did go to trial, but instead she accepted a plea to manslaughter with a sentence of 18 years in prison.
So the story does not stop there. I'd say, I think most people listening, like, how could she get 18 years for this? But it doesn't stop there, because there is this movement, this hashtag Stand With Helen movement. Can you talk about that?
Yeah, Helen accepts this guilty plea. She goes to prison. That was one of the longest sentence that we know of in Canada for a battered woman case. battered woman manslaughter case. And she essentially has no hope. But meanwhile, on the outside, there's a lot of people that just saw this and immediately felt like this sentence was wrong, that it was way out of proportion, that it was too long. I was one of those people, actually. Been a crime reporter for a long time. I've covered many, many murders and many, many, many murders of where men killed women who had never hurt them at all and who had received much lighter sentences. So this movement starts, and it's actually a pretty amazing thing because there's a large section of people who start independently are upset about this sentence and start to do what they can. So there's some pretty socially powerful people. There's some defense lawyers. There's a senator. There's an expert, Dr. Elizabeth Sheehy, who wrote a book defending battered women on trial. There's a man who's an activist who feels really strongly about women's self-defense survival cases. But then there's a lot of other people, like literally dozens and dozens and dozens of people who just felt this was wrong and wrote to Helen in prison, many of whom were survivors themselves, and they supported her and I think gave her the courage and the support to think about going ahead with an appeal. And then other people, thousands of people who signed petition, and also people who shared on social media with this, I stand with Helen, or other slogans looking to have her sentence overturned. So it was truly an effort by just a huge cross-section of people, everyone doing what they could. And that's one thing I found really amazing about it, is there's, you have people who are socially powerful doing what they can. And then there are people who did so much just by supporting Helen and believing her and sharing their own experiences with her. And I feel like that was, it was an amazing thing to see a movement that really comes from so many different parts of society.
It just touched so many people. Including you, and you've seen some of the most harsh things in your life, and it kind of spoke to you. Not that you're a cold-blooded, but yeah, it really spoke to you. So where did it all lead? First of all, I want to understand why this judge issued such a harsh sentence. Do you have any sense of that?
Yeah, so it was a joint submission by the defense and the Crown, that's the prosecutor here. And that was an agreement. And when both sides come to the judge with a deal, a plea bargain, the judge almost always will accept it, unless they see something that's really outrageous about it. Now, arguably,
this is outrageous.
He maybe should have seen that there was something outrageous about it, but he didn't. And he also made some comments that really, I think, helped just put this on people's radar, including, that Miles was a vulnerable victim asleep in his own home, and that this was a callous and cowardly act.
Wow.
And some of those statements just really, I think, were really inflammatory. And when you talk about when we talk about this cross section of people coming out in support of Helen, I think a big reason for that, part of it is that people saw this injustice in her case, but another part of it is that it speaks to how widespread this issue of domestic violence and intimate partner violence is, and that so many people have it in their own life, have had it in their own life, have had it in the life of a loved one. There are so many people affected by this issue. And so I think that is part of why people saw that this was so wrong with Helen. She was like a symbol for what so many people have been through. And that some of the judge's comments, in addition to this extremely long sentence, that too was almost like a flashpoint, because we know that so many people do live with this, and that is much, much harder than just saying, oh, you could have just left. I mean, the judge makes a comment about how she and her son Neil were not bad people, but they're people who made bad choices when there were other options available to them.
Yeah, like
and
yeah.
Exactly. I mean, that goes back to this. It's essentially a different way of saying, why didn't you leave? And we just know that is far far more complicated and far more dangerous than that.
So where are we now with this, this huge outpouring of support for her? Where are we now?
So her case was appealed. And this was, appealing a joint submission is like climbing a mountain. It was described to us as very, very, very difficult, but it was successful. And what's really kind of amazing is that one of the grounds of the appeal was that the sentence was so unfit that it would bring the administration of justice into disrepute. So
Wow.
essentially, the fact that so many people were angry about this sentence became a key aspect of the appeal that was in fact successful and cut the sentence in half down to 9 years, which many people still do see as a very
A
long
lot of time.
sentence and an unfit sentence. But I think it was probably the best thing that could have happened in the circumstances.
So you've met Helen, met numerous times. First of all, how did you convince her to talk to you? Because I know that she's pretty reticent to talk to anybody about this. She's a very private person. Obviously, she's gone through an unspeakable evil experience. How did you win her trust and get her to talk to you?
Yeah, so I wrote to Helen for the first time about 4 days after I saw the news story about her sentence. And I told her that I believed her story was very important and that I believed that sharing it could help other women. Mm-hmm. And at that point, her sentence hadn't been appealed or anything. She was still facing the 18 years there. I told her that, I believe that domestic violence is one of the most crucial issues facing all of us today, and that I really hope that sharing her story could help and sort of exposing how she was dealt with in the system. So she did not immediately agree. It took a really long time, and it took
a lot of back and forth.
A little bit of back and forth. I think I only sent 2 letters at that point.
Kind of waiting for her to.
Yeah. And then it was being appealed, and then I think I reached out again. I really didn't want to be harassing her. It was really important to me that if she did want to share her story, that it would be on her terms and her decision. Well, not on her terms, but that, she would decide to do it and feel empowered by that decision. And then ultimately she did, after the appeal, I'm trying to remember. I think she agreed to speak with me. I heard from her lawyer while we were waiting for the Court of Appeal to come back. And then we were going to wait until the appeal was back, and then until any period where the Crown could appeal the sentence further was finished. So we spoke for the first time in the spring of 2022. So she'd been sentenced in October 2020.
I'm trying to do the math in my head here. So she got 18 years in 2020. Then they cut the sentence to 9 years in 2022. When is she scheduled to be released?
She actually, the way the parole system works in Canada, is sort of, the idea is to help reintegrate people into society. So you're eligible for some unescorted temporary absences, and then day parole, and eventually full parole. So she actually was eligible, had her first hearing for day parole last December 2022. That was after I had, essentially, as I was completing my reporting, all my interviews with her and her family, friends, experts, and a print story that I did had come out at that point about her. And that's when she was, like right around the same time as she was getting ready for her first parole hearing. So I don't know if is it a spoiler or not how the hearing goes, but
we'll let the listeners, we'll leave them hanging a little bit on that one, because I really want people to listen to this podcast. Can you give us a little behind the scenes about what it was like to meet her? Like, where did you do it? I imagine were you sitting in a room where, was there glass between you? I know you had mentioned that it was hard. Sometimes the audio was hard because of, given the situation, but like, what was the give us a little bit of a sense of what that was like interviewing her.
Yeah, in Canada, doing a jailhouse interview is a lot more rare than it appears to be in the States.
Yeah.
It's very, very difficult to get access. And in fact, I never was able to get on her phone list. So she was never able to call me. I got approved for a few visits in person. And then the rest of the time we wrote letters to each other. She remains to this day the longest pen pal I've ever had.
Yeah.
Um, so the first time that we met, we were in a visiting room. It was just the two of us and her lawyer. It wasn't like visiting day or anything. It was just the three of us together at a table. There was literally the noisiest fan that anyone could ever have.
Right.
That would just come to life only at the most important moments, whenever something really powerful
Believe me, I
was
know
being
it.
said.
Doing a podcast, yes, it's always something always happens. Yes.
Yes. So that it was in a visiting room together.
Okay. And what was your impression of her? I mean, from when the first time you saw her, we mentioned that she's very small. Was she even smaller than you had envisioned her being? And what was your take?
Yeah, that was my first impression was how small she is, just how tiny. If you just saw her from the back, you could almost think it's a child, like a little boy. She's so tiny.
Right.
And then I think it's very apparent, and people can hear this definitely in her voice in the interviews, that she really did not want to talk to me and did not, was very uncomfortable
Yeah.
with all of this.
Why do you
But
think?
that,
Embarrassing and just also, yeah.
yeah, but that also, she had decided that she would talk. And so she, even knowing that it was painful, even knowing that it was uncomfortable, she was just going to do it. Helen is the kind of person, she does what she sets her mind to, and she does what she decides she should do.
Mm-hmm.
So it was really, I think it took so much courage from her to do that. And it really was in many ways a very selfless decision. And it really was because other people sharing their experiences have helped her so much, and that she really did hope, and as I did, that her sharing her story and us looking into the way the legal system treated her could actually help other women, which I do believe it has.
Yeah. Yeah. And for any cynical person listening to this saying, well, yeah, she was just trying to get a reduced sentence, that decision had already been made. Like this was more about her helping others, right?
Yeah. Everything was totally done at that point. Not only had the appeal been done, the appeal period had been done, it was finished. So yes, there was really no benefit at that point. She already had her supporters in her community that still supported her. And being interviewed by me is not easy either. Like I think our first interview was about 4 hours long.
Wow.
And one of the most intense interviews I've ever done. And yeah, they're not easy.
How was it intense for you? I mean, obviously the subject matter is incredibly intense, but I would imagine this is such a sensitive, even though she's agreed to talk to you, it's such a sensitive topic, and you don't want to be, as a reporter, I don't know, you don't want to be too sensational. You want to respect her privacy, but also you want her to tell the story, right? Which is so is that why it was so intense? Like, explain to me a little bit about that.
Yeah, I think, I knew that she was going to be sharing things with me that she had never told anyone.
Mm-hmm.
There was such limited information put on the record in court. She'd been assessed by a couple of forensic psychiatrists, I believe, or psychologists, but, very, very limited interactions. And she'd said very little to the people in her life, really. And so she was trusting me that she would share this life and what it
Probably
was
never
like.
said it out loud to anybody, right? Probably never.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And that is something I do not take lightly. And so that makes me tense. That makes me nervous. I was very nervous before this interview. And I do think I want people to feel empowered when they speak to me, that and you can hear a little bit. This is an interesting thing about podcasting. Normally I'm a print reporter,
Yeah.
that people can hear my reporting. They can hear me talking to Helen and how we interact a bit. I want her to feel empowered, that she can say that there's some things she doesn't really want to talk about. I mean, obviously we need enough information that I know that the story is true and accurate, and I need enough to tell the story properly and ethically and fully. But also, that doesn't mean that you have to open every single part of your life, for instance, for childhood.
Right.
So, and I think, it's funny, this would be one example of, I realized very quickly, because she pointed it out to me, that I guess I have a little bit of a tick when I'm interviewing people, where I would say to her, do you want to talk about what that was like? And she would always say, like, no, I don't want to talk about it. And so
Yeah. I don't want to talk about any of this, but I think
exactly.
I should. Yeah.
Exactly. So I think I feel like this with a lot of stories. I mean, I never lose I never lose sight of the fact that this is a real person, this is a real life, and they are trusting me to share the most important, the culmination of all their experience, their story, that I think is such, someone's story is so important, and it's so valuable, not in a monetary way, but in, like, to share your life experience to help others, to me, is one of the most, like, profound and beautiful things that can happen. And I don't take that lightly, and I don't want to screw it up, and I don't want to make any mistakes. And I want, in the end, even if she knows that it's not going to be an easy process, and it wasn't an easy process, but in the end, I want her to feel like it did something good, and that she's glad she made that decision. To think that she would, regret talking to me or something would be a devastating thing for me to deal with. I would really hate that. So that makes me real nervous.
Yeah.
Before I go to an interview.
You did a great job. You did a great job. And, she wasn't the only person you talked to either. You talked to her. Well, at least you talked to you talked to many people, but you talked to her family members who are, that was also difficult, because they have these secrets that they probably have never explained to anybody. Also, you had a really weird moment early on where I think it was Wes or something gets up and wants to show you the bulge in his pants.
Yes.
I was like sitting there in my car listening to this and be like, oh my God. But it's not what was going on there.
Yeah, that was Wes showing me a big bulge in his pants. And one of the moments when I was like, I'm so glad we're doing this for audio, because I don't think, no matter if I wrote that,
Yeah.
no. And in fact, that moment, because I did write this piece as a long form first before we started working on the podcast, I didn't mention that moment. It wasn't really relevant in the print piece, but that's the kind of moment that love to share with someone.
Yeah, by
audio.
the way, just for the little spoiler alert, it's not exactly what you think of it. He was going to show her a horrible hernia situation that he had that left a bulge in that part of his area. So anyway, well, one thing I'm thinking here is, it is such an important story to tell. What do you think, Helen? What would she have done differently? Because, like, let's say somebody somehow hears this, that is in a very similar situation than Helen was. We've kind of talked about how there really was no escape. And I wonder, what could she have done differently? Because she really tried to do everything. I mean, she was just trapped. And, obviously we don't want to advocate murdering the person who is victimizing you, but what else could she have done? Like, what is the message that we hope that other women in this situation take away?
To me, that question shows how ingrained it is for us to ask, like, to put the blame on the victim, essentially.
Yeah, you're right.
And it's a common question. And I asked it myself to myself.
Right.
And it took me a while to really realize, no, that's the wrong framing of the question, because there is no clear answer. Any way she could have gotten away was then going to be a coin toss of whether she got away with her life, whether her kids would have gotten away with their lives, whether other people, police officers, neighbors, random people would have gotten away with their lives. So I think instead the question is, how do we change the systems so that someone who is a victim of domestic violence has another option? Because to be honest, I don't think that Helen reasonably had another option that we would know for sure that she could escape with her life. And I say that as someone who has covered literally over 100 domestic homicides, probably. I started to count them. I started to go back through digital archives, looking back over my 25-year career to try to count how many women's murders I have covered. And then I just got to a point where I was like, why am I doing this? This is too depressing, and I don't need to do it. But that is the real question is, how do we reform the system? Because Helen could not have done anything differently. And in the end, I think it came down to that she knew that he was at his breaking point. He had this new brain injury that was changing, made his behavior even worse. He had these physical issues. They have no money. Everything's escalating. I think that she knew instinctively that things were at a breaking point and that there was a number, at least her and maybe many other people who were going to die. And she acted to protect, in self-defense, to protect herself and to protect her family. And so the question really is, how do we change systems? How do we change
such
support?
A good framing. Yeah, it's a great way to think about it, because you think, you hope somebody listening, maybe it's somebody who knows somebody who they, can tell is in a similar type of situation, and obviously we hope that people who have the power, government officials, et cetera, law enforcement that have the, that can intervene in some way, are listening and are thinking of, do I know somebody could be possibly in this situation, and how can I help, rather than putting the onus, completely on the victim. It's a good point.
We, my producer, Kasia Mihailovich, and we sort of framed this to ourselves as, it's under the true crime genre, but it's actually a little bit of a Trojan horse that starts out as true crime, oh, murder, and there's a, bad man who's disappeared and he's dead and all of that. And then you get to episode 5 and it's like, let us introduce you to Supreme Court Justice Bertha Wilson and the history of the battered woman defense. And that really is a way, this podcast is actually quite structural in terms of looking at the structures and systems, how they were formed and how they fail to deal with women who are living with domestic violence and survivors of domestic violence. We know they fail all kinds of populations, but as we spoke earlier, self-defense, which was essentially made for two men fighting, the whole history of the murder of women in the law, we have one of our experts talks about how historically the murder of women was treated almost like, accidental or understandable, whereas women's murder of their male partners was literally petty treason. It was acting against authority and was seen as much, much more serious. And I think that you can still see the roots of that in a lot of ways, that we, accept that in Canada, a woman is going to be killed by her partner, ex-partner every 2 days. And it is almost like people expect it. But I think clearly we can't accept that any longer, and that the structures need to be changed in a way that stops happening. And one point that I think is really important is that, we can almost think, well, this is a problem behind closed doors. I guess if a woman chooses to marry a man like this and then she ends up getting killed or whatever, that's her problem. That's a cynical way of looking at it, but I know there are people who, whether they would admit it or not, kind of do feel like that. But we know, and there's plenty of research about the connection between domestic violence and mass murder, mass homicide. We see it in I covered as a news reporter 2 of Canada's worst mass murders. It was the Portapique shooting, the James Smith Cree Nation stabbings. 2 of the worst mass murders in Canadian history in the past few years occurred, and they both of the perpetrators had histories of domestic violence. We know there is this link. We know that these are extremely dangerous calls for police to go to, for, extended family, members of the public. So I do really think that we all have a stake in trying to figure out, how do we get help for these men? How do we help men before they get to this point? How do we help, boys to not develop these kinds of extreme violent and controlling behaviors? And then how do we put, systems in place, make sure shelters are funded properly to help give women a way out, a safe way out? And then also, if it does come down to a lethal act of self-defense, which I believe this was, then making sure that the systems deal appropriately with the woman who has had to act to defend herself and her children and others in the public. And that's where the answer lies.
Has anybody ever come out in all your reporting in Miles' defense? I mean, I know it sounds preposterous, but of course we don't really hear his side of the story in this as much. Did you ever meet anybody who was like, oh, this is all blown out of proportion, they're just trying to get headlines, whatever horrible, cynical thing people will say? Did you ever run across people like that? Like one person that was like Team Miles?
No.
Okay.
And I looked for them. I wanted that person,
right.
And I approach every story, I didn't just fall off the turnip truck. So
yeah, exactly.
I'm a cynical person.
Yeah.
I always want to make sure that I'm not just, being told a story, or even in every story, there are, of course, multiple sides and multiple perspectives. So I wanted that. I wanted to know more about Miles. And even after the podcast came out, I have been expecting someone to email me. And I have not gotten that email. I've gotten many emails from other people who knew the family, who lived in the area, who taught one of the kids, pretty big circle of people who interacted them at some point, who say things like, we all knew not to go near Miles's house because, he might shoot you. We all, I saw Helen, I saw the bruises. Like, I've gotten a lot of those emails,
right?
But I have not gotten one that says this is all a lie. He was a great guy. And, I was kind of expecting at least one.
Yeah, at least one. Well, I guess it goes to show that, just how bad he was, and how bad the situation was. I want to shift gears slightly here and talk about just the storytelling aspect of this story. And you've told it now. You told it in two different mediums, as a podcast, as we mentioned, and as this wonderful story for the Globe and Mail, like a long form story. And I'm just curious. This is your first podcast, right? We're not the first time you've been on a podcast, but the first time you've hosted your own podcast.
Yes.
And you wrote the script, or maybe you wrote the script yourself?
So myself and Kasia Mihailovich,
okay.
who is the producer of this podcast, we did it together. This was a collaboration between
your
the two
idea
of us.
To do it as a podcast? Was it sort of a Globe and Mail's idea? Like, how did it all come about that you decided to do a podcast as well?
So in the summer of 2022, Kasia she was producing the Globe and Mail's podcast, The Decibel, which is sort of a daily news kind of podcast.
Mm-hmm.
And there was talk that she was going to move and do a more narrative podcast, and our first narrative podcast series. It would be the Globe's first. So I really wanted to try a podcast. So I sent a pitch. I sent like 5 different stories that I thought would
be many stories, I know.
that I thought would be good as a podcast. And I was just going to start reporting this one at the time. So they liked this story. Kasia liked this story and this issue. And so we decided, even though it wasn't confirmed, that I would basically get good audio of my interviews so that it would be an option for us. So the photographer who was going along to take pictures, Amber Bracken, would also record good audio. So the option was open to us. And so really up until, I think, till around the time that the print story ran, we did not know for sure it was going to be a podcast. But then after the story ran, it did well. And then we knew, okay, let's go ahead. And then Kasha and I, or the managers, I was ready to go ahead, but the powers that be decided, let's go ahead with this. And then Kasha and I started working on it, I believe in May.
Okay.
We began in earnest and looking at, how are we going to tell this story in this new form?
Yeah. So how was it different than the way you told it as a print story? Because I mean, one thing you mentioned that came to me right away is that you told in the first episode, you kind of give away the, who did, you didn't leave it a mystery who actually murdered Miles. Although there is some mystery there is a little bit of question whether she pulled the trigger. But anyway, we won't go there right now. But at least that is the the common narrative is that she pulled the trigger. So tell me a little bit about how you decide to tell a story differently in the podcast.
Yeah. So, I mean, I love form, right? I'm a structure nerd, hence why I'm also a listener to your podcast. I love thinking about the mechanics of storytelling. And so even when I was working on the print piece, that was something I had in mind. How would these two things be different? And so when we started, of course, I learned, having never done it before, I learned a lot from Kasha in starting to think about tape first and letting, okay, what's the great tape that we have?
Yes,
and how are we going to use that?
Yeah.
Yes, exactly. And so one thing that I had done with the print piece that some readers, astute readers, would notice is that Helen is deeply ingrained in the whole piece, but she is not quoted directly until the very end. So all of her information is like in the piece, baked into the narrative, but I don't quote her until the end. And there was one reason that I did that is that I didn't want, by seeing her quoted, that the reader would automatically know she's okay, she's talking to me, she's being quoted in the paper. I thought that would give like a symbol that in the end she's okay and she's talking. And I really didn't want to do that. I wanted to give people the suspense. Whereas in the podcast, it was really important to us to hear directly from Helen right away. We didn't want to keep that mystery of what happened per se. And we wanted to have Helen's voice in as soon as possible. And then also because of the additional space, in print, I think this piece was about 4,000 words, which is very long for a modern newspaper print piece. But having more episodes really gave us room to explore some other parts of the story that are much more about the structural systems. So, for instance, episode 4 is essentially all police interrogation, which allows us to really hear the dynamics. And I think that episode 4 was really, to me, one of the moments where I was just truly wowed about how different telling a story in audio is, and how I could have written an interrogation scene for 100 years and I would never be able to take readers inside it the same way that hearing that interrogation does, which is not the greatest revelation for a print reporter, I would say. But I think we just tried to look at what assets we had in audio that would be really powerful. Of course, Wes, who you mentioned in episode 3, I mean, Wes has this amazing voice, and he's this really fascinating character
his characters are wild.
Wes is like, he's a rough guy. There's things that could be really scary about him. I mean, he told me directly, like, I don't care at all about taking human life. I could kill 1,000 people. It wouldn't bother me a bit. But then on the other hand, he's very, very astute about the effects of abuse and, how living with abuse changes a person. I think a lot of people had a really powerful connection to Wes, a lot of listeners. And then of course, Helen. It was a long answer to your question.
No, it's a great answer. It's a great answer. And the podcast, what has been the reaction since the podcast has come out? Like how?
I mean, it's been amazing. It's been really amazing. It was the #1 podcast for all podcasts in Canada for, I think, about 2 weeks, which is pretty
Awesome.
great and #1 in true crime. I just got
first one. I've been at this for 4 years, and your first one goes to number. Thanks a lot. No,
yeah, it
awesome.
was, it was really, really meaningful. And especially because our goal always was, I really want this to do well because I want people to hear Helen's story. And also, well, I mean, I wanted it to do well too. But yeah, I felt it was an important story. And knowing that it's connecting with people like that has been really, really meaningful to Katja and to myself.
I mean, I'm so happy that you're telling the story, and I got to revisit it with you, and that what you're doing great work, and you're just your reporting and your writing is just so like on a next level that it's really exciting to talk to you. And I'm glad that you found me again and that we've reconnected. Janet, thank you so much for coming back on the podcast.
Thank you. It's been such a pleasure. And yeah, I'm a huge fan. Keep doing what you do.